And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and I will be doing another of these little videos about some literary concept. In this case, we're going to be looking at Marxism and literature. So, this is one of the contextual theories that is worth looking at because of its focus on class dynamics and such in literature. But first, let's actually talk a little bit about Marxism itself. What is Marxism? And then I'm going to do another video basically after this that is going to be about Marxist literary theories. That's actually going into specific theories that are Marxist, that come from Marxism. Today, though, let's look at it in very, very basic terms and sort of also vulgar terms. So, let's first just look at Marxism in general. So, first off, Marxism is quite an old theory now. It's 150 years old. Well, yeah, what we generally think of as Marxism. And when a lot of people who don't know Marxism very well, think of Marxism, they think of sort of communism, they think of the USSR, and they maybe think of China. Even though these countries are generally not actually communist countries, but that is how it is perceived. So a lot of people perceive it that communism basically hasn't beaten capitalism, and also it's often seen as having failed in many ways. Sort of places like the USSR and such, even though it wasn't actually communist, but whatever. But a lot of people see it as not having won the whole economics debate, if you could call it that. And so some people don't really see it as having much of a point. So it didn't beat capitalism and free market economics. So has it failed? And also, how does it relate to literature? Now, when it comes to Marxism and literature, Marx himself did actually write some stuff about aesthetics, like about art, but not that much. He was more focused on the economic and political side of Marxism. He did supposedly have some plans to write some stuff about literature, but he didn't get around to it because there's this medical condition that eventually happens to all of us. It's called death. He died, and so he didn't complete all the things that he wanted to complete in his life, which is a thing that happens to people. He didn't even finish his major, magnum opus, Das Kapital. He didn't actually even finish it because, or capital in English. He didn't finish it. He only wrote the first volume, and then the second and third volumes were completed by Friedrich Engels. So, he didn't get to do everything, which has basically meant that other writers, basically other Marxist thinkers, have had to now apply Marxist principles to literature and try to understand it in these kinds of ways. So first off, when it comes to Marxism, right, let's actually just say, we are going to go into some of the specifics of it, but Marxism is essentially quite an idealistic, even though it is actually anti-idealist, but I mean idealistic in the non-philosophical sense. I mean the idea that it's sort of utopian, right? It's the idea that there should be a cashless, classless society in which basically everybody works, and that we live by concepts such as, and now my mind is blanking, even though it's one of my favorite quotes. That's great. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. So basically, everybody works to the ability that they are able, and then everyone receives to the necessity that they require. So if you're younger and fitter and you're able to work harder, then you should work harder, and for the good of society, essentially. And you should receive the amount that you need to survive, and then somebody who might need less to survive receives essentially less. It is proportional rather than being purely equal. Pure equality, if everyone received the exact same amount of food, different people probably require different amounts of food. For instance, a person who is alone, a person who is a bachelor, right, or a bachelorette, whatever, they probably only need a one-bedroom home, whereas someone with a family probably needs a larger home to fit their children into it. So pure equality, everyone getting exactly the same, isn't really beneficial, but rather being proportional to the needs of the people. So that is sort of Marxism in extremely simplified, reductive terms. That's very, very simplified. That's not going into much depth. But one of the things that we're going to look at is the fact that Marxism is fundamentally materialist in nature, right? So it did take inspiration from idealists like Hegel, but it kind of rejects the idea of idealism. So idealism is the idea that basically everything's in your head, in a sense. What's I say? Wittgenstein, not Wittgenstein. See, now my brain is a terrible, terrible thing sometimes, and it forgets the names of people that I like. Schopenhauer said that, the whole world is me, basically. So you can't really prove that the rest of the world exists, but what we do know is what we can perceive. And we do assume that other people perceive the same things that we do, or at least perceive them in a similar way. So you might have that, that idea of, are we all actually seeing color the same way? Do we all experience the color red the same way, or do we have different ways in which we see red? That's quite idealist, the idea that it's in our heads that we can perceive these things in different ways, and they kind of make up our world. Whereas materialism is kind of seen as somewhat of the opposite of that, where it's saying we want to actually look at the physical world, the material world. And usually in terms of Marxist interpretation, we don't really care about things like ideas and thoughts and what have you. We care about what's actually happening, right? We're centering the material world over ideas and thoughts. So what people think about things doesn't really matter, when what actually matters is that they have food and shelter and, those kinds of things, companionship, that they have friends and that they're not struggling. Physical things that are real and tangible, not just your ideas and thoughts about the world, which is all lovely and great, but doesn't really help you when you're starving to death. So, furthermore, basically a lot of idealists sort of thought that the ideas and thoughts and ideas, thoughts, etc., like that, beliefs, they inform the material world. Like, they are the thing that create the material world into what it is. Thought creates the world. They think it's the other way around, the Marxists. They will say, no, it's more so that the material world but influences thought and ideas. Right? It's the other way around, like the exact opposite. So, to understand Marxism and basic Marxist principles, there's some terms you should know, like base and superstructure. So let's just quickly go over these. These are very basic concepts. Also, as a quick aside, they're not even written in these notes here, but things like proletariat and bourgeoisie are also concepts which I didn't even put here because I think that they're such basic concepts. The proletariat is basically the working class, and the bourgeoisie is the ruling class. And a lot of Marxism basically sees the world as a class struggle between these two groups, which I would say is quite a oversimplified way of looking at things. But that's sort of an older, more vulgar Marxism, which does not take into account nuanced things that are not basically class-based, but that's a whole different story. So as a very, very basic understanding of Marxism, base and superstructure. So the base is your economic base, it's the mode of production. So the basically economics, right? The economic reality of the world. Remember, this, like Marxism, is based on class, money, etc. It's based on that kind of stuff, which means that obviously the way in which money is created and commodities are created and sold and whatever is going to be extremely important. So that is the economic base. The superstructure is everything else, basically. So that's culture, education, politics, law, religion. Basically everything else that is not economics is the superstructure. And in many, it's sort of traditional Marxist interpretation, the base informs the superstructure. So the base is what leads to the superstructure's existence, which I would say is quite a reductive view and is not, it's a bit more complicated than that kind of one-to-one relationship. But even people like Marx and stuff were not necessarily looking at it a one-to-one relation, but they didn't exactly have time to do all the interpretation they wanted to do, and they died before they could do more stuff with it. Now, this means that in terms of our main area here, which is literature, is that literature becomes part of the superstructure, right? It's part of, culture, education, whatever. It's part of that, which means that it is heavily influenced by the economic base, which is true. Like, the literature that is sold is generally sold, the literature that is produced is sold, right? There are people who are a bit more anti-capitalist. For instance, people who produce stuff and release it for free on the internet. That's much less capitalistic because it's not being dominated by marketing and stuff like that, which is the economic base, trying to sell it. We have effectively commodified art. We basically looked at art and we were like, art is great and everything, but wouldn't it be nice if art was also a commodity, like coal? So that is what we can look at literature as from a Marxist perspective. But we will look at it, especially when we get to the literary theories, that will be in the next video, that looks at it in much more depth than this kind of more basic understanding. So let's look at some of these sort of the basics of Marxist theory in general, and these are often sort of conflated with one another or combined. So you get dialectical materialism, historical materialism, and then sort of communism and socialism, which are sort of broadly seen as the philosophy, scientific practice, and politics of Marxism. They're all different from each other, but they're also connected to each other. So dialectical materialism is sort of the philosophy of Marxism, which goes into these ideas of things like base and superstructure, but that's also historical materialism. But dialectical materialism is that sort of materialist, anti-idealist perspective, where we don't really care about thoughts and opinions and ideas and beliefs. Instead, we look at the material reality that led to those things, right? That is the more dialectical materialist thing. It's because it's also called dialectical because it kind of comes from Hegelian dialectics, which was a major influence on, I was about to say Freud, but a major influence on Marx, because dialectics it's a very old thing, but it's essentially an idea of a kind of societal communication of sorts of creating new structures. The sort of the most basic version is the idea of thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where there's some kind of a thesis, so an idea, which is then challenged by an antithesis, which then leads to a new synthesis, leads to something new. So, right, there's an idea A, which comes into conflict with idea B, which then equals, basically it essentially becomes idea C, which then can undergo the process again. C becomes A, and so on. So, let's just say if you took like politics, you could say, from a historical perspective, there was things like monarchism, right? So the idea that like there should be monarchs who have like supreme power, and then liberalism came in as the antithesis, which challenged monarchism, which challenged the idea there should be a king with the divine right to rule, which then eventually led to sort of the liberal democracy as it is, which then was challenged in other ways by different things. Now, dialectical materialism does take those kind of ideas, and it sort of does see Marxism as this dialectical relationship with capitalism. Like, Marxism only really makes sense against capitalism. It is in direct response to capitalism. Like, I saw a very funny, idiotic statement that was made by a certain billionaire who, instead of, he basically said Marx didn't write about communism, he wrote about capitalism. And he did write about communism, but he also did write about capitalism. His most influential book, which is Das Kapital, it's called Capital, is literally an analysis and interrogation of capitalism. It talks about the bad things in capitalism. It is a comprehensive breakdown in economic terms of capitalist economics. It is not about communism. It is a critique of capitalism, but it critiques capitalism as a way of encouraging communism. So, yes, it's not really about communism, it's about capitalism, but only because capitalism and communism exist in this dialectical relationship with each other to eventually create something new. So then historical materialism is more looking at the scientific practice of Marxism, usually understanding it from a historical perspective. Marxism looks at history from a fundamentally sort of class-based perspective, seeing how there's this proletariat and bourgeoisie dynamic kind of going all the time. And that has led to the present situation that we now experience. Now, of course, he was writing in the mid to late 1800s, so capitalism that existed back then was not exactly the same as it is now. It was harsher. For instance, modern day capitalism actually has quite a couple of socialist things that have been injected into it. Things like, say, maximum working hours and minimum wages. These are much more socialist. They're not really capitalists. Capitalists, if they could, would get away with paying less than minimum wage and working you 20 hours a day if they could. But they can't get away with that nowadays, generally, unless it's like a sweatshop. But in countries that have worker protections, that won't really it's better than it was during Marx's time, basically. But that doesn't mean capitalism has become good. It just means that the specific things that Marx was writing about don't necessarily perfectly relate to the modern era, because things have changed. For instance, Marx was unaware of the gig economy because the internet didn't exist. So you can't expect ancient texts, well, it's not ancient, it's like 150 years old, but you can't expect very old texts to be able to comment perfectly on the modern world. So you instead take those ideas, and then more modern Marxists have taken those older ideas and applied them to newer situations. And that's why when someone tries to argue against Marxism by just using Marx or Engels, you're using 100+ year texts to argue for something that has significantly changed in that 100+ years. But anyway, now the last of these things is communism/socialism. They are not the same thing. Just to say for those who don't actually know that, communism and socialism are not the same thing. Socialism, it's kind of, we usually see it as a transitionary period. So you start with capitalism, which goes to socialism, which then becomes communism. In a proper communist society, which has not actually existed on a broad scale, actual communism would have no money, no classes, etc. So things like USSR, Russia, China, Cuba, whatever, they're not communist countries. They have central leaders. They have money. These are not communist things. They might have some socialist things. China is actually very capitalist. It's ruled by a party that calls themselves a communist party, but it's not really. So that becomes, it's more of a state capitalism, but that becomes the politics of Marxism. So encouraging these kind of things. So socialism would usually be the more gradual, or at least in a lot of mainstream understanding of these terms. Socialism is kind of your transitionary period into things that are less capitalist, or capitalism with socialist elements. So, as I said, things like minimum wage, stuff like that, unemployment insurance, all of that sort of stuff, protections for workers and also consumers, becomes an important part of developing a more socialist world. Even though that is not actually what communism is. Communism would be, people living in communal circumstances in which there is no money, everything is basically, we're all the same people. But yeah, that is what the ultimate goal of Marxism is generally seen as being. So yeah, those are sort of your basics of Marxist theory. Now, the last thing I put here was that vulgar Marxism, which is like a literary thing a lot of the time, is the idea of this it's not just literary, but yeah, it's the idea of a one-to-one correlational relationship between base and superstructure. So basically saying that the economic base determines, in many ways, the superstructure. So while the base, right, is very influential, in a more vulgar Marxist perspective, the base has this more direct relationship with the superstructure. So economics influences what literature is made, which isn't true. People make whatever literature they want, but a lot of the more popular stuff is heavily informed by the economic base. But it is not a one-to-one relationship. It's not like when a trend arises in literature, that all literature becomes that because it makes money. There will be more of it, of that particular thing. Vampires become a popular thing, so now there's a lot more vampire books, but that doesn't mean that all books become vampire books. There are still all sorts of things being made, so it's not actually a one-to-one relationship, that's why they call it like vulgar Marxism. It's very reductive. But yeah, that becomes a bit of a problem. And things like that can be argued with things like, say, Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony, where it's sort of this idea that it's not actually this one-to-one relationship, but it's more the dominant classes influence the suppressed classes, which then kind of makes them consent to their own oppression in certain senses. But that is a whole other concept that you can look at cultural hegemony, which is a very interesting idea, but I'm not going to go into it in a lot of depth here. This is basically all I'm talking about it. But yeah, that is something that if you're interested in it, you can check out people who've done. I'm sure there will be like hour-long videos just talking about cultural hegemony, because it is a very interesting thing. But yeah, vulgar Marxism can be broken down by all sorts of theories like that very, very quickly. So yeah, that is pretty much all I'm going to talk about here, because the next video is actually about specific Marxist literary theories. Things like reflection theory, genetic theory, structural theory, all of these kind of things. So yeah, but if this was interesting to you, you can support this channel and me by checking out one of my books, like Fleshstone Blues, which is my current one I'm mostly focused on. It is a cyberpunk story that is has quite a bit of like Marxist influence in it, because it's a terrible nightmare dystopian capitalist world in which we figured out an amazing thing. We figured out how to transfer our consciousness into a chip that we can put in whatever body we want. Except those bodies cost money. And of course, because we're in a chip, you can't die, right? But that's also not really very good for the economy. We want people to kind of die eventually. So, because we have these chips, your consciousness is like a digital copy. Perfect. We can sell you heaven. So that is a fun little Marxist thing in that book if you want to check it out. Links in the description. Otherwise, you can like, comment, subscribe, do all that kind of stuff. If you want to comment and ask about a literary theory that I might know, please do so. I'll see if I do know it and understand it. And if I do, I might be able to make a video about it, or just respond if it's a short enough thing. So yeah, hopefully that has been helpful to you. I hope that you have a great day, weekend, month ahead, and goodbye.